Today's motion is India will replace China as the engine of global growth. We will now start the poll. You can please let us know whether you agree or disagree with the motion or whether you don't know yet. And while you vote, let me outline what we are actually debating today. India's economy, though slowing, is still outpacing many major economies with its growth. In fact, it is the fastest growing economy in the G20. It's also the poorest economy in the G20. Some analysts predict India will become the third largest economy in the world by 2027, overtaking Germany and Japan, both of which are still ahead of it. India has a large young population, ensuring the country has a big enough labor force needed for economic growth for decades to come. Especially the services sector with telecommunications and software is growing at an impressive speed, contributing already to around half of India's growth in GDP. Prime Minister Narendra Modi aims to make India a high-income country and, by implication, an economic superpower by 2047. At the same time, China's population is shrinking and its economic growth slowing as companies are looking to reduce their dependencies on the country. India's size and scale seem to make it an ideal candidate to offer an alternative. But of course, there are significant challenges. China's growth was fueled by manufacturing, a sector that is not nearly as developed in India and which contributes only very modestly to the country's GDP. Much of India's labor force is in the informal sector, and incomes of most people have not increased much or even stagnated in the recent years. And while the government is trying to cut red tape and has attempted to do so with the just released budget, foreign investment in India is still facing tremendous bureaucratic hurdles. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, for 3 decades, China benefited from a world open to trade, a very stark contrast, as this week has reminded us, to the current protectionist and isolationist trends India has to reckon with. Thank you very much for your votes. We are closing this poll now. We will not share the results with anyone, including our speakers, but we will use those results to calculate the difference at the very end. Now, please let me introduce our teams. As is customary, I will keep these introductions very short so we have more time for debate. More extensive biographies of everybody are on our website. On the team arguing in favor of today's motion, arguing that India indeed will replace China as the engine of global growth, is Alicia García Herrero, who is the chief economist, Asia Pacific at Natixis Bank, a senior fellow at the European think tank Bruegel, a non-resident research fellow at National University of Singapore's think tank, the East Asia Institute, and an adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Joining her to argue in favor of the motion is Rohit Lamba, joining us this morning from the United States. He's an assistant professor of economics at Cornell University. He has worked as an economist at the office of the chief economic advisor to the government of India. And together with Raghuram Rajan, he's the co-author of the book Breaking the Mold, Reimagining India's Economic Future. On the other side of this debate, arguing against the motion that India will replace China as the engine for global economic growth, are Rajat Kathuria, who is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and a professor of economics at Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence in Delhi. He's a former director and chief executive of the Indian Council for Research and on International Economic Relations. He was the co-chair of the T20 Digital Task Force under India's G20 presidency in 2023. And then joining him to argue against today's motion, finally, is Santosh Mehrotra, who is a visiting professor at the Center for Development Studies at the University of Bath in the UK, a research fellow at the ICA Institute of Labor Economics in Germany, and the Director General of the National Institute of Labor Economics Research and Development. Thank you all for joining us today. As is customary in these debates, the first opening remarks will come from the team arguing in favor of the motion, and that will come from Alicia today. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Alicia for her 4 minutes of opening remarks in today's debate. Please.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to argue in favor of the motion, which is basically that in India will, at some point in time, we've not defined that time, but I'm going to make it 2050 at the earliest, will basically be the larger than China. That actually means that it could happen much earlier than India contributes more than China to global growth, which is basically the motion. How can that be? Let me give you some numbers. So China today has a potential growth of around 4.5, max 5%. That's where it's growing, and that's its potential growth. But we are all aware that China is decelerating structurally. So in other words, that the benchmark that India has to achieve is lower than what we have in mind thinking about China. I think that's the key here. India doesn't have to do too much to become an economy of the size of China by 2050. Let me give you the numbers. China is expected to grow 2.3% by 2035, 1% by thereafter, meaning from 2035. Why that big reduction? Because its population, after completing urbanization, which is very different for India, will actually fall, the labor force in the cities, which are the productive part of China today. That will only start happening in 2035. So the benchmark for India is 1% growth from 2035. That is what makes it possible for an economy of 1/5 of the size of China to become the size of China. The other reason is that, as Nico said, India is the poorest country in the G20, but that helps, because that means that you basically are going to have an exchange rate that is going to appreciate against the RMB, which is already there at the equilibrium level. And that will help in dollar terms for India to become bigger. This is just statistical, but it is important for the question. On top of that, urbanization in India is half of that of China. China is nearly done with urbanization. So you don't need to do everything right or even half of it right to basically grow much faster than China, which is the benchmark here. So I used a few numbers, just, a growth rate falling for India, up to 20, up to 5 by 2035, and then 4.5 to get to India, get into the size of China by 2050. So my point here is very simple, is that the motion, as hard as it may look when you think about China, past China, isn't as hard as far as future China is concerned. And that is, for me, the key point. On top of that, we have, geopolitics, which plays in India's favor. And that basically means that, of course, India won't benefit from a globalized world. We understand that. But within that deglobalized or from fragmented world, if there is something that will be able to leak that fragmentation, that's services. And that's what India does well. So in that regard, India has a comparative advantage today that is the right one. China had it in the past, the right one for that time, but not the right one for this time. On top of that, of course, it is very obvious, more than ever with the Trump administration, that the future for China as an export economy, which is what China is very bleak. And that is not even included in our scenario. Finally, and I don't have any time, India is a consumption economy. And that makes a big difference to catch up with China faster than China has in the past.
All right. Perfect. Thank you very much, Alicia, for this strong opening remarks arguing in favor of the motion. I'm going to pass it right along to the team arguing against. Opening remarks will be delivered by Santosh Mehrotra, joining us today from India. Santosh, you have 4 minutes on the clock.
Right. Thank you very much indeed to the Asia Society for having us. So is India ready to replace China as the engine of global growth? I don't believe so. And we have essentially two reasons for arguing this. I'm sure Rajat will complement in his own way. China, please remember, is still growing fast. It's growing at over 4% per annum. It has been the fastest growing large economy in the world for the last 30 years. And while India and China started out in 1995 at the same level, today at purchasing power parity, which I take as more relevant, honestly, its GDP is actually $37,000. India, on the other hand, is only at $16,000. Now, point is, China growing at only 4% 4% per annum from $37,000 is going to be very difficult for India to catch up, even if India grows from its 16,000 at 7% per annum. And in any case, it's unlikely that China is going to slow down too much before 2035. It's something that we will discuss. And actually, China can, as IMF has rightly projected, carry out a whole series of reforms, and its capacity to conduct reforms is enormous. And therefore, it will be actually able to do many, many things that it has to reform its economy. The other argument that I would like to make is that India is suffering from far too many structural weaknesses. And I don't think Alicia took that into account. Believe it or not, China now contributes 1/3 to all global manufacturing. India still does not have an industrial policy. If anything, despite all the talk about Make in India, India's manufacturing contribution to GVA fell from the 17% it was for about 25 years, from 1991 to 2015. It's actually fallen to 13%, and it's only just climbing back. Manufacturing employment fell in absolute terms for the first time in India's history. By contrast, China still has a very strong industrial policy. It has two elements to its industrial policy program, Made in China 2025, and then the 10,000 Little Giants initiative. I could go on, but I'm going to be brief about India's weaknesses. I think they are fairly well known. Rohit Lamba himself talks about it in his book with Raghuram Rajan. The mean years of schooling of India are very low compared to China. The health status, as is reflected in the life expectancy, is low. Stunting is 35% of children, 35%. All of this translates into lower worker productivity compared to China consistently, and this is not changed for several decades, and because policies are not appropriate and have not changed, things are not improving. Job creation is not happening. We are adding 5 to 6 to 7 million young people to the labor force each year, but policy-induced mistakes have actually reversed the job creation that was happening. If India had continued to grow at 8% per annum as we were growing between 2004 and 14, it would have been a different story. But that's not the case. We've sent 80 million workers back to agriculture in the last 4 years alone. The COVID impact on human capital has been very severe, and the result of both the COVID impact as well as agriculture workers increasing is labor productivity is falling.
I'm going to have to cut you off, Santosh, as your time has run up, but I think this is a great place to end the argument. So thank you for that rebuttal and removing it. Sorry for those opening remarks. We're moving it back to the team arguing in favor of the motion for the rebuttal delivered by the aforementioned Rohit Lamba, who has also 4 minutes on his clock.
Thank you for having us. The motion before the House is India ready to replace China as the engine of global growth? So there are 3 key terms here, right? India, China, and global growth. And I think my teammate Alicia tried to clarify it and try to make a very persuasive opening pitch that it's what we're arguing is not just how good or bad India's chances are of living up its true potential. I don't think any one of us disagree in this panel for or against the motion that India is currently and perhaps in the near future will perform less than what largely experts believe to be its true potential. The argument before the House, the one that we are proposing, is not about India with respect to its own potential. Rather, it is whether India can actually be the next destination of global growth. And to be honest, we don't think there is any other option in some sense, both because of demography and importantly because of where India is at right now. Just to recap very quickly what Alicia was saying, was that China is already facing a deceleration. I admit to what Santosh is saying about that China still is doing relatively well, but we are talking about the next 30 years. The one-child policy had a pretty dramatic impact on the demographic composition of China. And as we know from global evidence, historical evidence, that it is very, very actually difficult to increase fertility rates, especially when growth rates are going up. So this is very, very important to keep in mind. China is going to face a kind of depopulation, albeit at a larger scale, but depopulation nonetheless on the same scale as what Japan and Korea are experiencing right now. So this is very important to keep in mind. Alicia already gave you the numbers. On the other hand, while a lot of the weaknesses, as Santosh rightly pointed out, and we have absolutely no problem in admitting them, though the stunting number is higher than what it is actually right now. What we have to understand is whether India can grow given its current policies and assuming slight improvements, very incremental improvements over time. Can it actually be the destination? Can it actually be the fastest growing country for the next foreseeable future? I think that's a no-brainer. Whether you look at any projections by any analysts all over the world, or you look at projections by the IMF, it is very clear that India is the fastest, and as Alicia underlined, and the poorest country in the G20. And historical evidence suggests, given the relative political stability in India, and India is not going to give you the brisk growth numbers of China in the late 90s and early 2000s, but what it will give you, as we have seen over the last 3 decades, is stable, steady numbers of around 6% for the next 20 to 30 years. And that would be enough to make India the center of engine of global growth. Now, the components of India's development, I think, are very nicely placed for it to actually take advantage of how the geopolitics of the world are changing. Most importantly, the production nature of the world is actually moving very fast and very rapidly towards services as opposed to manufacturing. So, the quintessential manufactured product with Henry Ford's car, today it is actually the Tesla car or the electric car. You can think of the highest value added in chips is not in the production, but actually in the design. India already has 20 to 30% of chip designers of the world. It is very important to understand that global production itself is either moving towards services, but also towards services embedded in manufacturing. So design of chips is actually a services embedded in manufacturing, which India is very, very good at. Global capability centers in India are already occupying a very, very large component of its exports. And finally, you may not care about, in the global arena about where you buy a washing machine from, but you will care, as recent events have shown, where your medical records, your financial records, and so on are. India's democracy places it very well for it to take advantage of this change in global production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohit Lamba, for that rebuttal in favor of today's motion. And now, last but definitely not least, I'm going to hand the floor to Rajat Kathuria, delivering his rebuttal against today's motion. Before I do so, let me remind the audience that now is a great time to think about and submit any questions that you have to our panelists. You can do so using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. Please also take a look at questions already submitted. You can upvote them if you like, and that will help us decide which ones to answer in the short time that we have after the rebuttal from Rajat. Rajat, you have 4 minutes on the clock as well.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you to the Asia Society Policy Institute for inviting me for this. So the motion before us is India ready to replace China as the engine of global growth? So there are 2 issues here. One is whether we replace China, and 2, whether we can play the same role as China has played or countries before us have played as an engine for global growth. So I'm going to emphasize whether India can be an engine for global growth. When I look at the world around, and I think everybody is talking about this, is that, as a democracy, almost the rest of the democratic world seems to want India to do well. It's almost as if they are willing India to become the next China or to be like China and to be the engine of global growth. So that is what I would call the secret life of Walter Mitty, or what we would say in Hindi. I don't know any of the audience will be able to understand this, as Mungeri Lal ke Haseen Sapne, or the secret life of Walter Mitty, is that, there are aspirations, but there is a reality. And the question is, will the reality today transform itself in such a manner to be able to play that role of an engine of global growth. I have no doubt in my mind that India will grow, and India will be amongst the fastest growing major economies in the world. But as Nico, you said, it is also the poorest. So just to catch up, India needs to grow much faster. I'm not going to focus on the domestic economy landscape that Santosh has already spoken about. I'm going to focus my comments against the motion in our external engagement. And just to juxtapose what India needs to do compared to what China has done before us, what Japan, Korea, United States have all done before us in terms of providing the rest of the world a market so that they can pull up the rest of the countries, which is what the meaning of engine of global growth, to my mind, is. Well, I remember when the G20 meetings were held and when we had the financial crisis, everybody wanted a country to play the role of engine of growth so that we can revive to sustainable, robust, and strong growth of 2.5%. And the countries that came up in those G20 meetings, of course, India was there, but China was the primary country that was, thought to play this role of an engine to kind of extricate the rest of the economies from the stagnation that had gripped the world after the financial crisis. So a few numbers I want to lay before you. China is the largest trading partner for 120 countries today. It is the largest trading partner for 120 countries today. India is the largest trading partner to none. China attracts $4 trillion worth of FDI in the last 20 years. India has attracted less than $1 trillion. China is a reserve currency. It is in the SDR basket. India is nowhere near being a reserve currency. China has 16 countries as FTA partners. India has very few countries as FTA partners. And I think India's reluctance to become engaged in global trade much more, and China's offensive interest in wanting to become engaged in global trade stand in complete contrast. Today, China tells us it is a member of RCEP and it wants to become a member of CPTPP. And it says, tell me what I need to do to become a member so that I can continue to play that role that China has played about being, a market for the rest of the world. India is very reluctant to play that role today. And I think given the inclement global environment, it will be very difficult for India to play the role that China has played in being an engine for the rest of the world.
Perfect. Rajat, thank you so much for that final rebuttal arguing against today's motion. We've already heard so many arguments. There are plenty of questions that I can ask, and I know there's plenty of questions from the audience as well. Alicia, you started with your opening remarks, so let me start with you. Both you and Rohit, I think, somewhat automatically made the assumption that persistent growth rates in India are almost inevitable due to its demographic development. And I do want to ask this question, I want to pose this question to you. How strong is the correlation between economic growth and demographics anyway, and how strong should we assume it to be in the future? There are plenty of countries out there who experience slow demographic growth or even negative demographic growth. There is some evidence that growth is possible with a slowing demographic, which would speak in favor of China. At the same time, there seems to be not necessarily strong evidence that just because your population is growing, your economy must grow as well. So that seems already somewhat of a spurious argument there, that the growing population almost necessitates growth rates. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Should I do that? So it's a question. So first of all, it's a very good question because there's a lot of countries with high population growth which will not necessarily grow fast, and that's because that's only part of the equation. But there's two things I think that add to the demographic dividend that India has, and there's countries with more demographic dividend, but India is also urbanized at a very low rate compared to many other countries. So I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's around 32%. China is at 64. So it's double. And that is very important because that is indeed demand for, it's fixed asset investment in infrastructure in the natural, which is a natural source of growth. So it's not only the demographics, it's the urbanization rate. And I want to add, if you allow me very quickly, that we need to understand what contribution to global growth is. This is the way I read the motion means. It means size multiply growth. So if I have a country with wonderful demographics, better than India, but it's tiny, it's not relevant for this motion. So, we need big countries with decent growth, not necessarily the highest growth. And India was not there during the global financial crisis because its size was tiny, much more than today. So, I just want to make the point that India is the only country of a size relevant to consider it here, plus the demographics, plus the urbanization.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. It strikes me, and that happens very often in these kind of debates, that I think the two teams are in a way arguing on a slightly different level. Alicia and Rohit, you made the argument, you made it very convincingly, about sort of the inevitability or at least high likelihood of a certain trajectory that the Indian economy is taking. Alicia just reinforced this point based on demographics. On the other side, Santosh and Rajat, you made a very convincing case, of all the structural weaknesses and just sort of plain numbers that sort of argue against the current motion before us today, as we see it today. But the motion does project into the future. It doesn't say that India is replacing China as the engine of global growth now, but that it will in the future. So, Rajat, you said at the very end that China is the largest trading partner for 120 countries, and India is not the largest trading partner for any country, which I think is a fascinating statistic and one to be, it's almost a bit mind-boggling that a country of the size of India would not be anyone's largest trading partner. However, I haven't actually gone back and looked at the numbers, but I would argue that if we went back 30 years or so, or 35 years, China probably also wasn't anyone's largest trading partner, right? So what makes you so sure, not just of the current state being this way, but of India's inability or at least unlikeliness of actually pursuing a similar path?
So the reason I think it will be difficult or challenging for India to become as open or as inviting for foreign direct investment and global trade as China has been, even, if one goes back to what China was, the fact that China grew at double-digit rates for over 3 decades sort of gave it the confidence to be able to engage with the global economy. And I don't think India will grow at the same rates as China, as everybody has said. And I think that confidence to engage with the rest of the world, that economic I would say the economic might to be able to engage. China had it much easier than we are going to have it because the world is becoming more fragmented. It's becoming more closed. And India will have to put its money where its mouth is, in the sense that it will have to be more open to make the world more open for itself. So that will be a big challenge that India will face over the next. And I'm not sure that India is going to grow at the rates that China did. And it's not going to be as open to trade as China was and China is. Because remember, China still, as Santosh was saying, there are vast reaches of China that has still to be developed, that have still to be urbanized. So China is not relenting its or relinquishing its mantle as the factory of the world now or in the next decade. It will continue to be the factory of the world. And I don't think that India will be able to develop without shoring up its manufacturing sector on the back of just services.
Thank you. Rohit, you made, I think, a very important point in your rebuttal. And you're also making this point in the book that you co-authored with Raghuram Rajan, is that if India is to experience the kind of growth that you're projecting, it will be driven by services, not by manufacturing. And I think that's an important argument, just because it also shows that if any country is to sort of play the role in the future that China has played in the past, it will likely look different from the way that China has developed. You made some good points. You mentioned, that services contribute quite a lot to GDP already. 20 to 30%, I think you said, of chip designers are in India. But still, right, we hear a lot, and Santosh said this in his opening remarks, we hear a lot of 1 million job seekers entering the job market in India every month. And the economy, despite 7% growth, 6.5% growth, as we've seen in recent years, and that are projected, the job market is just not creating these jobs to absorb these people. So why is that the case? And why do you think that would change? Or does it even need to change for the motion to come to fruition?
Thanks, Nico. So I think one needs to just separate out the internality of the argument from the opposing kind of, what the debate is about. I don't disagree with most points that Rajat and Santosh are raising, though I do want to say that this overemphasis that we have had on trade, one needs to take this trade arguments and facts into perspective. Even though they're correct facts, is that we're talking mostly about merchandise exports, and the world is changing. And even when you talk about merchandise exports, a large part of the value added into the merchandise exports is actually services. So you might be considering an iPhone that is being exported from China into the West as a Chinese export, but the large part of value added in that iPhone is actually already being captured in the United States, which is about 60 to 70%. So I think it's a bit misleading when we say that I completely admit that China is and will continue to be one of the largest merchandise export partners of most places in the world. But the way even manufacturing is changing with the large amount of services embedded in them positions India very well to be able to capture a large part of value added of trade. And I'm not saying this is for sure, but this is kind of highly likely going into the future. Now, what you're saying, there's this famous Joan Robinson quote, right? Everything that is true about India, the opposite is also true, right? So what you're saying is absolutely true. And I'm not disagreeing with that. And I've written about this extensively, actually, about the employment crisis in India and so on. But what we are trying to argue is that all these facts can be simultaneously true. India does have this very unequal in terms of skilled labor force. It has some of the most skilled engineers in the world, but it also has a large number of unskilled people and unemployed people with low skills that are not able to generate good jobs. They have some jobs, they're not able to get good jobs. This is not going to change overnight. But what is changing, for example, because of geopolitics, is that a lot of very highly skilled Indians are not, because of what is happening in the United States, what is happening in the UK, are more highly likely to stay back in India than they were 20, 30 years ago. So you are now seeing many, many highly skilled engineers, especially in the tech sector, who are staying back in India and who are going to create these firms with high value added. This is not going to solve all of India's employment problems, but it is going to keep, which is what you started this Q&A with, the sort of steadiness of Indian growth rate in the foreseeable future, which is what at the back of it, which you're arguing. Can India grow at 6 to 7% steadily over the next 30 years? And all the indicators, all the arguments that we are putting on the table because of trade, because of skills, because of demography, because of urbanization, point towards that India can do that. And when you combine with what we expect the deceleration in China, all the facts, including what our opponents are saying to be true, if you combine these two facts together, what we're saying is that India is not going to grow at the gangbuster rates as China. This is that internal debate that I was talking about. But India is inevitably and already is going to be the center of where the fastest growing 1.5 billion people of the world are going to stay.
Thank you, Rohit. I do want to very quickly follow up because it seems important to clarify is what you're saying is that India can achieve the steady growth that you've described while there's still a huge majority, or despite there still being a huge majority of job seekers of ending up in informal, low-skilled sectors, or is your argument that this will inevitably have to change at a certain point?
Absolutely, it will inevitably have to change. But I think one thing that people are missing is that what is remarkable about India, it is the only country of its size, actually only country of any size, that has been consistently democratic with despite being poor. Why is that important? Is that arguably in any other country with this kind of a difference between aspiration and reality, you could see civil strife, which is what would push a country back from. But India, because it's actually a very vibrant, albeit even sometimes chaotic democracy, it allows you to these pressure valves. which is why I expect that yes, there will be some level of resentment, by the difference between aspirations and reality. The gap is going to close for sure between the aspirations and reality. It's going to be slow but steady. I'm not saying that it's going to change overnight. The gap is going to close, but it is the democratic nature of Indian society that is going to reduce the amount of uncertainty as far as growth is concerned.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm gonna bring in some questions from the audience. There are many, and they're very, very good. So we talked a little bit also about structural weaknesses. Santosh, is what you mentioned, and we talked actually quite little so far about policy. But Rajat, in his rebuttal, did mention, India's reluctance to sort of engage in policies that, in your view, would maximize economic growth, especially when it comes to free trade. It pulled out of the RCEP free trade agreement kind of at the last minute. And so the question, Santosh, which I'm directing at you, coming from the audience, does India even want to be the engine of global economic growth? Is this even, when we look at the Indian policymaking community, is this an ambition that is there, or is, the policymaking more concerned with other priorities? Is that a factor, that it's not just something that cannot be achieved or is unlikely to be achieved, but maybe not even something that doesn't even want to be achieved?
No, I don't believe that that's the case. It's certainly, the leadership certainly wants to achieve it. I mean, the leadership has stated so. It's stated quite emphatically that we want to become a rich country by 2047, which is exactly 24 years from now. I don't think the policymakers are taking into account the structural weaknesses of India. And nor are they taking into account that no international agency is willing to bet that this decade or even in the next decade, India is going to grow at more than 6.5% per annum. And if India is to become, just to reach the sort of $14,000 at market exchange rate at current prices, which is high income status, by 2047, which is 100 years from independence, it has to grow at 8% per annum. But neither I nor probably any of the other speakers here are making the case that we can grow at 8%. No one's making the case that we can be 9 or 10 or 9 or 10% at China. No one's making that case. I don't think it's anyone's case. The more important point is I don't think either the speakers here or the leadership of India is taking into account India's structural weaknesses. And there's one major structural weakness that I haven't so far mentioned, which actually besets the entire society and therefore actually impacts the economy. And I relate the problem of caste. The problem of caste is becoming very obvious, and we all know that 75 to 80% of those who are poor, multidimensionally poor, or those below a certain consumption level, are those who are not upper caste. And that makes it very difficult for the Indian society to coalesce and therefore actually push back the state. And so in that situation, I think India's democracy is bit of is misleading. The fact of the matter is that India is actually more fiscally centralized state than China is. You won't believe this. There are three differences, main three differences in terms of the governance system of India and China. One, of course, is obvious. We are a multi-party democracy. They are a one-party state. The other, which most people don't know in terms of the constitution, is that we are a federal constitution, but they are a unitary constitution. Now look at the third difference. The third is what's most paradoxical. And that's, in a sense, underlying the thrust of my argument why it's going to be very difficult for India to be the driving force of growth and become a rich country, which is this, that despite the fact that they are the one-party state, they are the unitary constitution, we are the federation, we are the multi-party democracy, but they are more fiscally decentralized than we are. And because they are more fiscally decentralized, they have managed to grow much faster, and we have been not only much more fiscally centralized, we have become more fiscally centralized in the last 10 years. and this is going to damage us, and it's hurting our democracy already. I don't think this is sufficiently understood. And the other point I want to make about, Rohit's argument about the services driving our growth. Well, this global capability centers, this new economy notion that has been put out by a lot of economists, especially the Morgan Stanley and Standard & Poor and so on, is only 15% of the economy. 85% of the economy, is the old economy, informal workers. And as you've rightly noted, it's the vast majority of the workers are informal. And if incomes for them do not grow, and if they are not growing, if you're going to push them back into agriculture, they are not going to grow. If manufacturing is actually declining, I told you manufacturing contribution to GVA is declining, manufacturing contribution to employment is fallen. Under the circumstances, the demographic benefits that Alicia has been talking about, let's just remind ourselves, we already slowed down to 5.8% per annum in the last 10 years. Had we continued on the trajectory that we were on between 2004 and 14, it would have been a different matter. There was genuine hope. Inequality.
Can I just very quickly come in, Nico, with your permission?
Very quickly, because we only have a few minutes left, and there's one question from the audience. Let me ask that question. I was going to ask you anyway, and then feel free to sort of respond briefly to Santosh. So we're already almost out of time for the Q&A portion, but there's a bunch of questions actually that I think go in a similar direction. And the way I wanted to kind of bring them together is, we talked a little bit about services. We talked about AI, about automation. Rohit, you made the point, that this is in India's favor because it would emphasize the services. But of course, there's the opposite side of the argument, and you hear this sometimes when people make positive statements about the Japanese economy and now increasing the Chinese economy, which is that increasing automation would allow an economy to experience high growth rates despite a declining population. So this could kind of, in a way, go either way. Why are you so convinced it's beneficial for India and would not actually end up making the problem even worse?
No, I agree with you. I mean, but I think there is, this demographic thing, very quickly, I don't think it's a sufficient condition, but for a large class of large countries, it has been a necessary condition. If you look at the boomers in the US, if you look at Japan, Korea, if you look at China and so on. We don't know yet. Like I think there is too much speculation about what automation can or cannot do about growth. Yes, of course, it adds a large amount of productivity and therefore can lead to growth. But what are its other implications on society, on the way societal composition affects growth and so on? So I'm not. I think this is fairly speculative. And I'll quickly come back to it, but I just wanted to make 2 or 3 comments about, the caste argument that Santosh gave. I don't know, why is that relevant for this debate in some sense, because, almost all indicators, caste indicators, social mobility indicators in India have been improving. I think this thing about 15 GCCs and this exports being only 15% of the economy, they've only come into their own in the last 10 years. And in the last 10 years, to go from less than 5% to 15% of the economy actually makes our case that the vibrancy of this sector within India's economy and at the global scale is actually getting better over and over again. I think it's important to understand that what may have been a weakness, and I admit that, the political economy weakness of having democratized too early and having deindustrialized too early for India, I think it's important to understand, or at least give the argument a chance that actually this could play into India's advantage very well, given the geopolitics and changing nature of production in the near future. Quickly onto your point, I do think that it's not obvious right now actually, like which way the tech and the AI stuff is going to go, and in some sense, China has the lead over India. In many other dimensions, India has the lead over China. I think the reason why India has a lot of promise in this sector is because of the openness of its market and society relative to China. Even if you use DeepSeek today, it actually doesn't answer big political questions. I'm not saying that's going to be the case for the entirety of the future, but there is nothing that explains a churn in Chinese society that is going to make it open to technology at a global scale. And very quickly about the fiscally centralized argument, I think it's a very good argument that Santosh made. But on the other hand, another reality is also that states that are doing well are precisely the states that are seeing large amounts of foreign direct investment in India. For example, the state of Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is basically an OECD country right now in terms of various economic and social indicators. So while it is true that India does need to kind of fiscally re-decentralize, at the same time, it is true that states that do give certain kinds of incentives for foreign industry to come in are doing very well.
All right, thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to move on, but you will all have the chance to make your final arguments. We're moving on to closing remarks in the same order as we've heard from all of you in the beginning. 2 minutes on the clock again for each speaker. And the first 2 minutes go to Alicia García Herrero, making her final case in favor of today's motion. Alicia, please.
Okay, so the main point I want to make, in addition to those we have discussed for the motion, is really the definition of the motion. We're talking about contributing to global growth. China, and let's forget about structural deceleration. I want to focus on one important point. When you produce 30% of industrial production and you export, you're the largest exporter of the world, and you have 1 trillion trade surplus, you're not allowing others. I mean, you're not contributing as you think, as we're discussing now, because this is your own growth. You're not giving growth to others. You're not importing from others. Why is that the case? Because China's consumption to GDP is very low, around 30%. You're about 70. So, that's the point. You just need to be slightly bigger to become the largest importer in the world, which is what matters to contribute to global growth. And that is something that is already happening in some sectors. If you talk to anybody exporting oil in the world, it's no longer about China, it's about you, it's about India. So why, if you are so close? Because you consume, and this will become even more true for luxury goods. So you will become the center for them, because you're consuming, because you will frankly have a current account deficit for years to come. And China won't ever, possibly, because its model is based on taking growth from others, not giving growth to others. So that's a very, very important point, I think, to consider in this discussion. You will become the engine of growth for reasons unrelated to your growth rate, but to your growth model, which is based on consumption.
Thank you very much for that. For these closing remarks, also perfectly on time, Alicia. We're going to pass it right along to Santosh for his final 2 minutes closing remarks, arguing against today's motion. Santosh, please.
Just 3 arguments. Firstly, let's just remind ourselves about IMF's reform-based scenario for growth after 2035. Yes, growth is going to decline to about 3.8 to 2.8%. But if it reforms, the IMF says the state can actually, the growth rate can continue at 4.7%. At a much higher base, 4.7% growth, if the IMF estimate is right, means that the growth will continue and India will never be able to drive the growth. And please remember that the Chinese state is a very competent state. That was the point I was making. The second point, as far as India's weaknesses are concerned, I'll just refer to 2 again. Well, the new economy might have gone from 5% to 15%, Rohit said. The fact of the matter is 15% is still, short of 85% of the rest of the economy. Is 85% of the economy going to be driven by the 15%? Fact of the matter is high-skilled worker jobs in the GCCs are fine, but the jobs have to come from manufacturing, and that's really what's going to reduce the inequality. And finally, the caste argument is important because it's becoming a source of social conflict, and it is a source of continued inequality. Now, Alicia may be right, Alicia may well be right, that our market is large, therefore we will be able to continue to maintain our import surplus. Fact of the matter is that India has become more unequal today than it was 100 years ago, and its inequality is greater than that of China. It's the consumption of the rich and rich alone, primarily, which is driving the growth. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing as well from Santosh. Thank you so much for this. Closing remarks now from Rohit Lamba, arguing in favor of the motion, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists. Just very quickly, first point, there's a changing nature of production all over the world. The changing nature of production actually not only includes tradable services, but also services embedded in manufacturing, on both dimensions on which India is very well placed, actually much better placed than China to take advantage of it. Second is that no matter what you may read in the foreign press and so on, India's democracy is actually fairly stable. This is very important because despite all the good arguments that our panelists against the motion are making about inequality and so on, it is actually, this is what I was trying to tell Nico in the response to the question, it is actually the democracy that is the social valve to release pressures in India, which has worked very, very well and will continue to do so in the near future. Third point, India has done dramatically well in high-skilled services and will continue to do very, very well. It is going to be abetted, actually, helped by the fact that the West is closing in on immigration and foreign talent of various kinds. So you will actually see in the near future, in the next 10 to 15 years, which had been India's Achilles heel in some ways, the large amount of brain drain that is happening to get reduced, both because of increasing opportunities in India in the high-tech sector, and also because the West closing in. A point that Alicia mentioned, which didn't get talked about enough today, is the point of urbanization. India is going to see larger rates of urbanization. That means more room for capital investment in infrastructure, but also more room for increase in productivity. So it is true that not everybody in India will be working in high-skilled services, but what is actually going to happen if you create enough wealth, if you create enough cities, we know from the US and various other parts of the world that jobs are automatically created. Just to end the motion now, I think it is important to understand that India is not going to grow at the rate that China did in the late 90s and early 2000s, but India inevitably and realistically is going to be the center of global growth, if not now, but in 10, 20 years from now and in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, closing remarks arguing against today's motion from Rajat Kathuria. You have 2 minutes as well.
Thank you. I'll focus on what has already been said, and I want to focus on something that we haven't yet talked about. Yes, we will grow. India will grow, maybe not at the rates that China grew, but India will grow at the rates of 5 to 6% over the next few years. But I think what Santosh and I are talking about, what is the quality of that growth? Is it going to be unequal? India has already had very, very unequal growth. The share of labor has actually fallen and the share of capital has risen. For a labor-abundant country, you actually want the reverse to happen. So is services sector going to drive the growth? Will it create more inequality? And I think if we rely completely on services, it's going to drive more inequality in the country. And unless we make those investments in health and education, I don't see that service to democratize growth, which means add to the quality of growth. What that would mean for social cohesion, what it will mean for our democracy, it remains an unknown, but it is important to get that right today. The other point is, along with size, demographics, urbanization, it is the quality of your urbanization, the quality of the governance that is important for urbanizations. And for a country that has had difficulty managing traffic in urban areas, I don't think how is it going to be able to manage the quality of governance in urban areas. Urbanization will drive growth, but equally important, what will drive growth is the quality of urban governance. And that doesn't inspire confidence in a country like India. And the last point I will make, coming back to the points that I made about China, is that China has made inroads into institutions globally. I'm not talking about domestic institutions, which refer to the quality of growth that Santosh has already spoken about. I'm talking about inroads that India has not made into institutions outside. India is not a member of any trade institutions. China has become a member of AAIF, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. It leads that bank. It drives the BRICS Bank. India's participation in global institutions is very low. And to be an engine of global growth, India will have to be. Yes.
Perfect. I think that's a very important point you made there just at the end. We'll take that with us. Thank you all so much for this debate. I know this could have gone on for many more hours, and I'm sure it will in other places. But for this specific Oxford debate, we've come to the end. All that is left to do is to vote for a second time. So now I'm going to ask the audience to vote again whether you agree or disagree with today's motion that India is ready to replace China as the engine of global growth. And because a lot have been said today, we will let you vote for about 45 seconds in peace and silence. I'm told that the results are ready. So would now ask the team to show them. I have not seen them, so let's look at them together. Here we go. So the team arguing in favor of the motion, 23% at the beginning, team disagreeing with the motion, 53%. After the debate, this was 29% in agreement and 60% against. This is highly interesting. So we had a huge share of people who made up their mind during the debate. Almost a quarter of you did not know where to go with this. Only 11% no. Both teams made huge gains, but the team arguing against the motion, Rajat Kathuria and Santosh Mehrotra, but just barely eked out a win with 7% plus versus 6% plus. So you are declared the winner of this debate today. Congratulations, Santosh and Rajat. Thank you, of course, as well, Rohit and Alicia. This was a close one.